Welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible study on this very cold, blustery Northeast Texas day. I want to encourage everyone to please be careful if you're out and about, and looks like additional winter weather is headed our way, so don't get out unless you need to, and stay home and stay warm. And of course, if you need anything, be sure and let us know up here at the office. Really excited to be resuming our Wednesday evening Bible studies together. So if you're watching this video, obviously you have found us. And each evening at Wednesday evening at 6:30, I'll be posting a Bible study over the next several weeks. And let's jump right into our study. F. Bruce was a prominent New Testament scholar in the 20th century. He is deceased now, but in his book titled Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free, Bruce writes these words: "Time and again, when the gospel has been in danger of being fettered and disabled in the bonds of legalism or outworn tradition, it has been the words of Paul that have broken the bonds and set the gospel free to exert its emancipating power once more in the life of mankind." Among those liberating words of the Apostle Paul are the words he wrote to the Christians in the Roman province of Galatia in the first century. And so tonight, with this Bible study, we began to look at Paul's letter to the Galatians. And tonight, I want to spend just a few minutes sharing some introductory type information. This Sunday, I will begin preaching through the book of Galatians. And this Sunday, our text will be the opening greeting or salutation. And I will be preaching from chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And so then next Wednesday night, I'll have some additional comments or remarks from those particular verses because I won't be able to cover everything in that text in one sermon. But tonight, again, just some introductory type information that we generally cover when we begin the study of a new book of the Bible. So let me begin this way. I want to suggest 5 things that we will see in the book of Galatians, which really emphasizes its importance for us. Galatians is only 6 chapters long, and it covers some of the same themes that the book of Romans covers. Romans, of course, is 16 chapters long, and so Galatians may be neglected a little bit because in the letter to the Christians in Rome, Paul goes into a little more depth, explains a little more about the gospel of Jesus that he proclaimed, and so maybe we neglect Galatians some. But 5 reasons which illustrate just how important Galatians is. Number 1, it defines the nature of the gospel of Jesus. And Paul jumps right into that theme in the first few verses of chapter 1. Number 2, it describes the pattern of life that Christians should embrace in light of that gospel. And Paul really develops that theme in chapters 5 and 6 after he deals with some pretty deep theological matters about the gospel of grace. He then gets very practical in chapters 5 and 6 because of what we believe about the gospel. This is how the gospel then should look as we live our lives before Jesus. Number 3, it raises important questions about how Christians should view the Old Testament in general and the law of Moses in particular. We have often in churches of Christ been accused of not believing in the Old Testament or perhaps neglecting the importance of the Old Testament. Well, maybe a study of Galatians will help us better understand the role of the Old Testament, and again, specifically the law of Moses should play in our lives. Number 4, Galatians also outlines the basis of unity in Jesus and gives instructions on how issues of diversity ought to be handled and how to resolve conflict. I just completed a short series of sermons on racial reconciliation. Well, we'll see in Paul's letter to the Galatians that there was some reconciling that needed to occur between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Some issues of race and ethnicity had crept into the church there, among the churches, the congregations in Galatia, and was disrupting the unity that we are to experience together in the body of Christ. And then finally, number 5, Galatians certainly emphasizes the grace of God. And I'll have some more to say about that in just a moment. So with those 5 reasons as to why a study of Galatians, I believe, is important, let me now just share some of the typical introductory type material that we might cover as we begin the study of a new book. The original recipients, and there is some debate and some discussion about this, but I am convinced that Galatians is written to Christians in churches that Paul and Barnabas established on their first missionary journey that we can read about in Acts chapter 13 and verse 1 and continuing through chapter 14 and verse 28. So if that is the case, then this letter would have been written sometime after Paul's first missionary journey, which we can date somewhat accurately from probably 46 to 48. And we'll have some more to say about Pauline chronology, or the chronology of Paul's career as a missionary when we get into chapter 2 a little bit. And as I've said before, New Testament chronology is not always an exact science. So a date for Galatians would have been after Paul's first missionary journey, when he and Barnabas established a number of churches in the southern Roman province of Galatia. And then I'm convinced that this letter was written before the Jerusalem conference that Luke tells us about in Acts chapter 15, which occurred in approximately AD 50. So Galatians then must have been written by Paul sometime after his first missionary journey, sometime before the Jerusalem conference of Acts 15, which only leaves us with basically AD 49. And so we might at least attach that date to Galatians. It's very apparent in a simple reading of Galatians that Paul has some opponents that he is dealing with in this letter. He doesn't tell us as much as we maybe wish he had, but he characterizes his opponents with two verbs in Galatians. In chapter 1 and verse 7, and in chapter 5 and verse 10, he uses a verb which describes these opponents as causing trouble among the Christians of Galatia. And the word that's translated trouble means to confuse, to upset, to disturb, or maybe the best translation would be to agitate. Well, then again, in chapter 5, verse 12, he uses a second verb to identify his opponents. And this particular verb is synonymous with the first one. It means something like turning upside down, to unsettle, to disquiet, to distract. And so because of Paul's use of these two verbs to describe these opponents, a number of New Testament scholars will refer to his opponents as agitators. These agitators appear to be Jewish Christians who were demanding that Gentile Christians, in addition to being baptized into Jesus, also be circumcised and obey some ritual aspects of the law of Moses. The question might be asked, why would obedience to the law of Moses, and especially circumcision for Gentile males, be attractive? Well, I might suggest 4 reasons why. Number 1, it was a visible sign of being a member of God's family, that is, the physical act of circumcision. Number 2, it was symbolic of being a descendant of Abraham. Number 3, it might be seen as a step towards disciplining the flesh, bringing those worldly desires into check, so to speak. And then number 4, it would exempt from persecution, as Christianity could then be viewed as simply a sect of Judaism. The Roman authorities allowed Jews to practice their faithfulness to God as they saw fit, and were not persecuted because of their faith. And so if these new Gentile Christians also practiced the law of Moses, they might exempt themselves from Roman persecution. And we'll discuss these agitators and some of the things that they were promoting and pushing up on the Gentile Christians as we continue through this study. Well, if you noticed or saw the post I posted Sunday morning about this particular series, I've chosen as a theme Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6 from the New International Version, living in the grace of Jesus. The body of the letter, after the salutation in verses 1 through 12, and before Paul's conclusion in chapter 6, verses 11 through 18, we really see this theme of living in the grace of Jesus developed. And so here is where we're headed over the next several weeks. Chapter 1, verse 13 through chapter 2 and verse 21. We'll see the grace of Jesus defended. In chapter 3, Paul will explain the grace of Jesus. In chapter 4, the grace of Jesus will be clarified by Paul. In chapter 5, the grace of Jesus will then be applied to our Christian lives. And finally, in chapter 6, verses 1 through 10, Paul hones that application in, and he'll discuss the grace of Jesus intensified, how it should be lived out amongst ourselves within the body of Christ. So as we develop this particular theme, we'll see Paul make 4 key points about the grace of Jesus. Number 1, the grace, or his message in this letter, warns against abusing the true gospel of Jesus. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. We'll jump right into that next Sunday. It upholds the significance of the grace of God. Paul will emphasize that especially in chapter 2, verses 16 through 21. A text, whether you have read Galatians recently or not, you will be very familiar with. Number 3, it presents the true function, as I mentioned earlier, of the Mosaic law. We see that in chapter 3 and verse 24. And then finally, it provides the needed balance between the abuse of liberty and the judgmental nature of legalism. Paul discusses this, especially in chapter 5, verses 13 through 14. So, that concludes this brief introduction to the book of Galatians. Again, this Sunday morning, I will be preaching from Galatians chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. The title of that lesson is A Sarcastic Salutation. And this time next week, we will also go back to that particular text and discuss it a little more in depth. So let me encourage you to please be reading through the book of Galatians over the next several weeks. Have a wonderful Wednesday evening and a great rest of this week, and hope to see you here on Sunday morning.